we'd like to have her present. Our first reader will be Sandra Fox Murphy. Sandra is the author of 2 historical fiction novels, 1,000 Stars and That Beautiful Season. Her award-winning paranormal short story, Passage, was recently published, and she is currently working on the Fidelia McCord series about a family of pioneers on its way to Central Texas. Please join me in welcoming Sandra Fox Murphy. Can everybody hear all right?
If not, let me know. Okay. I'm Sandra Fox Murphy, as she said, and I was inspired early on by the beatnik poets when I lived in Northern California, and I started playing around with poetry, but I did not start writing seriously until I retired. So since then, I've been working on all kinds of poetry, novels, and short stories. This is my second novel called That Beautiful Season, and I want to say, first of all, that the artwork on this cover was a painting by my great-great-grandmother, who was born before the Civil War. So, this is a book that's set near the Chesapeake Bay, and it's about 3 main characters called Silas and Ava and a daughter named Sylvie. It is a book about family, and it's a book about the impact of war on people and about the love of the land. So let me read a few passages. I'll start with the first chapter. And you know, this first was inspired by a short story I wrote called Empty House. And as writers often know, when you start writing, those characters in the short story they wouldn't stop talking to me. So that's where this novel came from. As a matter of fact, even after the novel, I've written a poem about one of the characters. It's like they still won't stop talking to me. But this is from the first chapter. Darkness began to fill the sky, and the small cabin sat still and gloomy in the valley. No smoke rose from the chimney. Silas stood at the crest of the hill, puzzled by the sight before him. No candlelight, no sign of life. After the miles he had walked, after years of dodging bullets and sabers, living in war's squalor, he had foreseen a different homecoming. Thoughts of his Ava had traveled with him every day since he left this place, each night as he drifted toward dreams. He had smelled her sweet hair, the vanilla she wore at the nape of her neck, remembered the light silkiness of her soft skin against his, and gazing into the gravity of her hazel green eyes. He remembered the curve of her bosom and the gentle swell at her waist with her first child sprouting in her womb. He had yearned for years to hold her in his arms again. Their child would be 4 now. Silas found it hard to move from the spot where he stood. Where should I go? Where are they? He pulled his leathered flask from his sack and poured the last drops of whiskey down his scorched throat, then began his descent toward the empty house. It was still his home, and may hold clues. A missive may lie on the table. The final battle of Petersburg had been fierce, and it seemed endless. The dead, both gray and blue, scattered about the field as far as one could see. Those who had not been so lucky lay in agony. Death moans sometimes still echoed in Silas's head. On a sunny spring day, the medics saved those they could. The scene did not reveal that the battle had been won. Those who remained were not the eager men they had been when they left home to take up arms, but were fragile shells that had once held a zeal for life, like the empty cockle that laid still on the beach. The president released the remaining soldiers in early June, and Silas had been walking now for more than a week, sleeping with others near one campfire after another as they traveled home, some to the south, some to the north. A friend of his had been captured at Gettysburg. He prayed he lived to return home to his family near Reading. Silas was one of the lucky ones with an injury to his arm that healed quickly enough to avert the loss of a limb, unlike so many others. Those he'd left on the main road were hungry, shattered, but the war was done. Meadowlarks and red-winged blackbirds sang for the dawn just beyond the horizon. Their song was Silas's only welcome. He pushed the door, pushed hard, and finally it opened. Rodents scattered with a flutter, followed by silence. The home reeked of a vermin presence, but nothing more. In the blackness, Silas found a candle, and taking a flint from his pocket, lit it, and with the flame lit an old Betty lamp on the kitchen table. There was no electricity in rural Maryland, nor was there elation to be seen with a light. The flickering flame revealed tossed chairs and dust cloaking family objects around him. No letter lay on the table, only layers of powdery grime and dishes left hastily and scoured clean by critters finding comfort in Silas's cabin. After 6 days, the little house in the woods was cleaned, the well pumped. Silas pulled invading creeping oxalis and purslane from the yard and through the garden, revealing sprouts of onions and squash sprung from seed. He washed laundry, his own as well as the bedding. He ate one fine meal when he shot 2 quail in the woods. But still, there was no sign of his wife. And then we're going to go to a year later. His wife had come home. She had been abducted by Confederate renegades, and she arrived home with a child. And it wasn't the child that they had been waiting for. Ava's spirit had been altered. Silences passed between them, round and round like the whirling eddies in the Elk River. Silas held Ava long when they embraced, afraid to let go of her, fearful she might vanish like his comrades on the battlefield who had dissolved to vapors, gases freed into the heavens. The firmament remained thick between the couple. Silas and Ava still had no child of their own, and redemption was absent like a darkened firefly. The unsaid words blanketed Ava's sorrow and Silas's conflict. Ava knew well she indulged her child, that she had been negligent in teaching her proper habits, while Silas's heart found it hard to see the girl as his own. She was a radiant but precocious child, but not his. She was Ava's daughter. She knew nothing but this life, free as a spirit on a farm near the woods, a soul who loved as much to bask in the rain as in the sunshine. Winter approached, and as the snow fell, Ava woke to its chill and the whistling of the wind. She found a fire in the fireplace warming the kitchen. She could not find her daughter. She was not in her bed. Still in her linen chemise and barefoot, Ava walked toward the kitchen, and there she saw Silas. He was pulling heavy pantaloons onto the young girl, up under her green coat. He pulled on her rain boots, and he drew white mittens onto her tiny hands. The child stood gazing up into Silas's face. Sylvie's red curls sprung loose around the white hat, covering her ears. Ava said nothing, but standing behind the fireplace, watched the sight before her eyes. Let's go. Let's go feed the cows and horses. Brace yourself for the cold, and he opened the door. Allons, said Sylvie, taking Silas's hand. As snowflakes fluttered into the room and just before the door closed, Ava heard Sylvie yell into the snowfall, "Let's go, Pa." The young girl giggled. The young girl's giggle faded as the door closed. Ava's hand rose to her chest, and her breath caught in her throat. At that moment, the universe halted a beat, and then jostled into its destined orbit, and Ava's heart slipped back into place. And I'm going to go up a little farther. There's a character in this novel called Luther. And Luther was a slave that was sold as a young child to another plantation, and a young couple were going to escape from the plantation, and they took this little orphan boy with them, and they went to a maroon. And so that's his history. He has come to live at the Greenwood farm and to help his father, who is the farmhand. And this is the part where there's a hurricane coming up the East Coast. And the other character here is Samuel. Samuel is, and we've gone forward, because Samuel is Sylvie's son, Silas's grandson. In October, the storm came. Silas had heard in town that a hurricane was on its way from the tropics. His almanac had a warning, so he watched and listened. When the chirping and mewling ceased, and when he saw the skies darken to gray to the southeast, he called Ezekiel to help gather the animals into the barn, ensuring they had feed. They tied tarred canvas tightly over the chicken coop, and then smaller tarpaulin over the cottage windows and windows not shuttered at the house. Now it was time to wait. Run down to the river and rope the dinghy to the tree. Tight, yelled Silas. The family gathered in the darkened kitchen. Sylvie lit a kerosene lamp as they gathered around the table with their coffee. Dinner of barley soup and a pound cake Sylvie had baked. Luther walked in dripping and soaked to the bone, saying the boat was secure. Silas got him an old dry shirt and some pants from his own closet. We'll wait it out. I'm certain the bay and river will surge, but we are fine, said Silas. Right, Sam? As he kneaded the boy's shoulder and sighed, Samuel nodded in agreement. It's not our first storm, said Sylvie. Let's eat. I'll get some cheese and preserves. Luther joined his pa and the family at the table. Thank you, Sylvie. I remember these storms in Carolina and then in the swamp in Virginia, where the water would get high and nothing was dry, said Luther. You lived in the swamp, said Luther, his eyes growing wide. Said Samuel, his eyes growing wide. The winds picked up outside, branches creaked, and the roof began to rattle. Yes, I did. When I was a child, it was like an adventure and we ate lots of fish. It was a better life than the tobacco farms where they worked us to the bone, added Luther wistfully. As the winds blew, the rain sideways into the night, pelting the tarps and the shutters, Luther told stories of life in the Great Dismal. Stories of how they traveled about the swamp in the canoes, snakes as thick as one's legs swirled in the trees, living deep in the wooded islands without sunshine. There were ghosts in those swamps, said Luther. Samuel snuggled closer to his ma. Ghosts? Yes. Nowhere was it as dark as in those swamps at night. Even the moonlight and starlight couldn't find their way into the cover of the Dismal. And sometimes one could hear a boat or something floating through the water. But no one was in the boat. It was moving on its own, said Luther. The plantation owners, the soldiers, were afraid to come in looking for us. Sometimes when they did, they never came out. But there was so much love living within the vines, freedom, music, and gospel songs. The very dangers protected us, said Luther. I'm so glad you were free, said Ezekiel. The shadows wavered throughout the room, formed by the fluttering flame in the lamp, and added life to Luther's stories. As time passed, Sylvie was the first to fall asleep. Samuel fought sleep, immersed in Luther's stories, but nevertheless, sleep eventually took him. Ezekiel sat rapt at his son's memories of his childhood. Silas and Luther opened the door in the morning at first light to breathe in the fresh air. Storms had a way of cleansing. The chickens were loose, and one of the trees near the barn had come down. The only other damage was a loose shutter on the south side of the house, and the men set to work cleaning the yard, sawing the downed tree into firewood, feeding the animals. It was a new day.
Anyone have any questions for Sandra?
I have one.
Okay.
Did you choose the Civil War as the setting for your books, or did the Civil War choose you?
Well, it started as a short story, and
Why did you put it in the Civil War? Have you had a lifelong interest in this?
I love all the early history of the country, all this, because my first book was in 1600. So, but I do love the era of the Civil War also, and I think I did choose the Civil War as the era to set this in, and it fit with the location, and it fit with the story of him coming home to an empty house where his family was missing.
Yeah.
How do you choose what to read? Out of,
out of this?
out of a whole book that has interesting.
I know that was there were some other things I could have read, but I like the character of Luther, and I wanted to read a little bit about Luther because he's not a main character, but he's one of a character that's important to us. So.
And about how long did it take you to write this book?
Took me about 6 months to write it, a few more months to edit it. I got it out, with everything, I got it out in about a year.
What are you publishing next?
Well, I'm working on a collection of poetry, but I'm working on a story of a woman called, well, the real woman is called Fidelia Roby. And this got inspired by the King Cabin out in northwest Austin. There's an old log cabin called the King Cabin. And I thought, well, who the heck lived there? So I researched and found out that it wasn't built by John King. It was built by a Roby. It was built by this girl's, Fidelia's father. Her name was Roby. And so she's inspired me to write this story. A lot of what's in the story that I'm writing is true, but I'm definitely fictionalizing it because there's not a lot of information about her life after the wagon train to Texas. But the horrible things that happened in the wagon train, the horrible tragedies they went through, those are in the book. And it turns out this book appears to have turned into a series because I'm more than halfway through this book and the girl is only 8 years old. So this was the story of the woman of Fidelia McCord. So there'll be a couple more books after this book.
Sounds wonderful. I can't wait to see.
Thank you.